Ridgemont High was no stranger to rumors. For decades, students had told tales of strange happenings in its dimly lit hallways and unassuming classrooms, where time seemed to stand still. The legend of the disappearing hall monitor was the most infamous of them all. Students whispered about Mr. Grayson, a hall monitor from the 1950s, who was so strict in his devotion to enforcing the school's code that he reportedly stayed even beyond death to ensure that the rules were upheld. Tim Harper, a junior with a mischievous streak, couldn't help but laugh at the story. One October afternoon, as he and his friends lingered by their lockers, he scoffed at the latest retelling. A ghostly hall monitor? That's just the seniors' way of spooking us. You'd have to be crazy to believe it, he said with a smirk. His friends laughed uneasily, but Jessica, Tim's best friend, raised an eyebrow. Maybe, but don't you think it's strange how people just disappear? And how their things are left exactly as they were? Tim shrugged it off, chuckling at her worry, but deep down, the thought planted a small seed of doubt. Later that evening, he would face the consequences of his dismissal in the empty, haunting hallways of Ridgemont High. It was well after the last bell had rung when Tim realized he'd forgotten his science book in his locker. The quiet of the deserted school felt heavier than usual, pressing down on him as he made his way through the shadowed hallways. Lockers lined the walls, each one seemingly watching him as he moved. As he grabbed his book and slammed the locker shut, a sound caught his attention. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and growing closer. Tim's pulse quickened. He turned to see a figure at the far end of the hallway, a tall, stern man in an old-fashioned navy blue uniform, an armband labeled monitor in white letters strapped to his sleeve. "Excuse me, young man," the figure called, his voice resonating in the empty corridor. "You shouldn't be here without a pass." Tim tried to speak, but his throat went dry. The man's gaze was unnerving, cold, unyielding, and unnatural. Forcing a laugh, Tim stammered, I was just leaving." The hall monitor's face remained impassive. "Rules are rules. You must come with me," he said, reaching out a gloved hand. Before Tim could react, the man's icy grip tightened on his shoulder. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and the world around him blurred. When the vertigo cleared, he found himself standing in the same Ridgemont High corridor. Yet everything was different. The school looked older, the walls lined with yellowed posters from decades past. The lockers were painted in faded green, and the air felt thick, heavy with silence. He quickly noticed the clothes of the other students. They were all dressed in 1950s attire, their gazes empty, almost robotic. Tim's heart raced as he realized he was no longer in his own time. The next day, Jessica grew worried when Tim didn't show up for class. She checked his locker, which looked untouched, and her gut told her something was wrong. Determined to find answers, she retraced his steps from the previous day, walking the empty hallways as a chilling quiet settled around her. She couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, and as she turned a corner, she saw him. Standing at the end of the hall was the same figure from the legends, the hall monitor, his gaze fixed squarely on her. He looked just as the stories described, like he'd walked straight out of an old photograph. Jessica felt a wave of dread wash over her. "You're not allowed in the hall without a pass," he intoned, his voice cold and impassive. Jessica's voice caught as she replied, I'm looking for my friend." "Rules are rules," the hall monitor replied, stepping toward her and reaching out. As his hand touched her shoulder, her vision blurred, and she felt as though she were being pulled through time itself. When her surroundings sharpened, she found herself in the same eerie, outdated Ridgemont High. The hallways were filled with students in vintage clothing, all moving in strict lines, their faces expressionless. "Tim," she called, her voice trembling, but the faces around her remained blank, void of any recognition. Over the next few days, Tim and Jessica struggled to adjust to their new reality. The school was more like a prison, and every aspect of their daily routine was monitored. Hall passes were a necessity, speaking out of turn was forbidden, and all students were expected to move in perfect lines. Each room held an eerie silence, and the other students, some who had been there since the 1950s, seemed to be losing pieces of themselves with every passing day. They soon encountered Jimmy Larkin, a quiet, withdrawn student who had been trapped in the 1950s Ridgemont for over 2 years. His eyes had a haunted look, and his voice was barely above a whisper as he warned them of the hall monitor's punishment for breaking the rules. "They take you to the punishment room. No one comes back the same," he said, glancing over his shoulder in fear. One afternoon, while in the cafeteria, Tim noticed a faint crack in one of the walls. It was small, almost invisible, but it shimmered slightly in the dim light. Jessica nudged him, nodding toward the crack. "I think that could be our way out," she whispered. "We need to find out more." Later, Jessica managed to find her way to the library, where she encountered Mrs. Stevens, an elderly librarian who had been at Ridgemont since its earliest days. Jessica approached her cautiously, wondering if this version of Mrs. Stevens was somehow part of the strange 1950s reality. "Mrs. Stevens, do you know about the hall monitor?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Stevens glanced around before replying. "I do, more than you realize." She hesitated, her gaze distant. "He was once a man of principle, a man named Mr. Grayson. He valued order, discipline, and respect, but his devotion became an obsession. When he passed, his spirit couldn't rest. He felt compelled to uphold his rules. The crack in the cafeteria wall, it's his weakness. But beware, he guards it fiercely." Jessica thanked Mrs. Stevens and shared the information with Tim. They were filled with a renewed sense of purpose, but they also knew they'd need a plan and courage to make it out. Tim, Jessica, and Jimmy devised a plan. They would wait until the hall monitor's rounds took him away from the cafeteria and would make a run for the crack in the wall. The risk was high, but it was their only chance. That night, they watched as the hall monitor made his rounds, his expression impassive as he moved with rigid precision. Tim held Jessica's hand, both for courage and to ensure they wouldn't be separated. "Ready," he whispered. She nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The three of them dashed toward the cafeteria, their footsteps barely making a sound on the old linoleum floor. As they reached the wall, the crack shimmered more brightly, as though recognizing their need to escape. But just as they neared it, a familiar, icy voice echoed through the room. "Where do you think you're going?" They turned to see the hall monitor standing behind them, his face expressionless, yet his eyes filled with an eerie, angry light. "You broke the rules," he stated. Jessica and Tim looked at each other, fear coursing through their veins. With no other option, they threw themselves into the crack in the wall, feeling it pull them in as the hall monitor reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of Jessica's sleeve. They fell through darkness, feeling as though they were tumbling through time itself. When they finally landed, they were back in the modern-day Ridgemont High, surrounded by the comforting noise of their classmates bustling around them. The hallway was warm, filled with the light of the afternoon sun. But something inside them had changed. They knew the truth about the hall monitor, about the dangers that lurked within the walls of Ridgemont High. The hall monitor's voice, cold and unyielding, echoed in their minds, reminding them that rules, when followed blindly, could imprison just as easily as they could protect. From that day on, Tim and Jessica took the story of the hall monitor seriously, hoping to warn others. They knew the hall monitor would one day return, waiting in the shadows, ready to enforce his code. Blind obedience to authority can lead to traps from which there may be no escape. While rules serve a purpose, the story of Tim and Jessica reminds us of the importance of questioning, balancing respect for structure with the courage to seek freedom.